Mirziyoyev is much more open to the neighbors. He recognizes that, in fact, the prosperity as well as the stability of Uzbekistan requires excellent relations with the neighbors. And from the very first days in office, he reached out to his colleagues in capitals across Central Asia. And Ambassador Vahabov described some of the changes the border agreements reached. Also very important has been the opening of trade. I was told that, for example, trade with Kyrgyzstan is up 69% this calendar year. And there's also serious discussions, positive and serious discussions, regarding the critical water issue in the region. So this is, I think, already apparent, and I expect more and very good things in this basket. The second area is what you might call internal liberalization, starting with the economy, but not just. And the steps here have also been clear, albeit not as firm and not as far-reaching as on the foreign side. And so I think, and I've actually was cautioned by, including senior Uzbeks, that this is important, we're making progress, but one should not be overly optimistic about what is achievable in the short run. And just one last point, as I said, this opening internally does not just refer to the economy. You recently had the senior official from the UN responsible for religious affairs in Tashkent. You have an invitation to the UN torture rapporteur, something I had something to do with back in 2002. So these are all steps which also suggest that there's a leavening of Uzbek society.
Thank you. And so, Ilan, I know we've talked a little bit about how the conference in Samarkand fits into this overall change narrative. I'd like to share with the audience sort of how you see the conference fitting into facilitating some of this change, or at least putting some of it on display.
No, I think that's a good question, and I think they're really, in the macro sense, there were two objectives of the conference. One was this this new, as the ambassador said, this new convening function, the ability of Uzbekistan to play that role of being the heart of Central Asia, to really sort of bring together folks. And the second is, and this was achieved, I think, resounding, the level of participation, in addition to all the foreign ministers of all the Central Asian states, the European Union's foreign policy czar, Federico Mogherini was there, the Iranian foreign minister was there, there's representation from Russia and China, robust representation from the US government. People were taking notice, and I think that's important in and of itself, but it's also an important validation for the Uzbek government about the fact that the changes that are taking place in Uzbekistan, the changes that have been mapped, are beginning to sort of percolate into the consciousness of the international community. The second notion is that the conference is intended to be a jumping off point for a broader regional dialogue about integration, about the things that President Mirziyoyev has talked about, the need for greater connectivity in economics, greater connectivity in telecom and transportation links. That's a work in progress, because it's not entirely up to the Uzbek government. It's something that needs to be engaged with the other Central Asian states. On a positive note, this seems to be taking place. The foreign ministers, the consultative group of foreign ministers, as per when I left Tashkent a few days ago, was planning to meet most likely in Astana in March of next year to begin this process. So I think, on the initial front, Uzbekistan as a platform, I think that job was accomplished, and I think that Uzbekistan as a sort of initiator of dialogue, that's very much in progress, but the signs are positive so far.
And at the risk of jumping around a little, I want to talk to Blaise a little bit, bring him in on the U.S. angle. So the United States is not known for paying as much attention to Central Asia as Central Asians sometimes wish. So what is important about Uzbekistan for the United States? Blaise?
Well, I think there's a question of what should be important about Uzbekistan for the United States and what is currently important. And I think, to jump a little bit off of Ilan's points, as remarkable as it was how broad an attendance there was at this conference, how many different countries were represented and wanted to be there, signaling that they see that there is something important about the region. I think from a lot of the presentations you saw that they're not really thinking about Central Asia in its own right. Catherine, you wrote in the Diplomat, I think, very well about the presentation of the Pakistani National Security Advisor, which we don't need to go into here. But even the US presentation was largely focused on Afghanistan and Pakistan and not talking about Central Asia. Federica Mogherini, the EU foreign minister, came and said the most important tenet of security for the Central Asia region is preserving the Iran nuclear deal, which, whatever you think about it, I'm not sure what its relation to the region is. The foreign minister of Iran, Zarif, came and he spoke and he said the most important thing for Central Asia is making sure that the expansionist Zionist regime, I'm not sure which one he was referring to, stays out of the region. Right? So, you know, I think there's still a lot of countries that see Central Asia as an appendage to other regions or a place where other problems play out. Not really a region in its own right or a place where our interests can be pursued just there. And I think that's something that hopefully this conference in Samarkand will begin the process of changing. And we'll start conversations like this one here in DC to start thinking about that. But I'm not sure that's really been very well formulated either in Washington or in other capitals around the world.
Yeah, I think that's a very good way of looking at it. I know that I noticed that you can't have a conversation about Central Asian security without it becoming a conversation about Afghanistan. Not that that isn't a relevant thing to talk about, but I think there are security issues in Central Asia that are about Central Asia that are not about Afghanistan, and we don't really get to those. And I think some of that was actually illustrated right before our trip. I know I was in Germany when this happened. I was on vacation, and I find out that an Uzbek gentleman had driven a truck through a bike lane in New York, and suddenly Uzbekistan is in the news. And I think the American public doesn't know terribly much about Uzbekistan, and the phrase hotbed of terrorism is probably one of my least favorite things because it doesn't really tell us anything about Uzbekistan. I would like to see if you guys have any sort of reactions to the formulation of Uzbekistan, in particular in the American media, but sort of how this relation to terrorism either is I don't think it's a good, I don't know what the word I'm looking for. I don't think it's a very good connection to make, but maybe it is, and maybe I'm wrong, and you're welcome to disagree with me. Does that conversation about the hotbed of terrorism in Uzbekistan reflect what's going on in the country and the region, or is it just sort of a thing that people say because they keep reading it in, USA Today, and so they keep repeating the same thing, and they just go to the Wikipedia page and IMU, woo, and that's it.
Well, I'm happy to sort of to offer just a few thoughts. So three things really. The first is that as someone who spends a lot of time working on Islamic extremism sort of broadly, globally, I think there's a danger to both oversell and to underplay what's happening in the Middle East space and how it's going to affect other regions. We've had something on the order of 40,000 foreign fighters that have joined the Islamic State so far. A significant number has come from Russia and the post-Soviet space. In this particular case, Russia is sort of the central problem, much more so than the Central Asian republics. And this is where sort of the definition of Central Asia is sort of the hotbed of terrorism, which is very unfortunate, and it's something that's being parroted not only in USA Today, but there was a piece in the Wall Street Journal the day after the terrorist attack in New York, which sort of framed the same thing, without going into the details of the fact that most of Central Asian radicalization, of the elements of Central Asia that are not radicalized within the borders of Central Asia. There's actually a very strong positive correlation between Uzbek migrant labor, for example, that goes to Russia and the radicalization there and then the transition to the Middle East, right? This is a dynamic that institutes like the Royal Institute for Policy Studies in London is working on. But it sort of bears noting because it suggests that the problem is not internal to Central Asia. It's adjacent to it, but it's not internal to it. But that doesn't mean that it's not an issue of concern for Uzbekistan. And this is why I think it's necessary to understand what's happening in Tashkent and the policy rethink that's taking place, not only in security terms. Because for Uzbekistan, economics is security. The stronger, more stable the Uzbek economy is, the less, and the more jobs there are, the less need there is for a massive migrant force to leave the country. Meaning that there were less Uzbeks who are prone to radicalization beyond the borders. So I think it's necessary to understand this policy strategy, and it's really a sort of a five-pronged one, right? Everything from administrative to legal reform, to economic reform, to human rights reforms, to foreign policy. And again, right, we're in the early days, and this is sort of all uneven, but it is not all separate. It is connected, and we have to understand how this all links up to the things that we tend to care more most about, which is security.
Sure. If I could just build on that, I think there is also an interaction between this new policy of openness that Ambassador Herbst described, and this issue of radicalized Uzbeks who might not be in Uzbekistan, and trying to figure out how you address the internal security. So on the one hand, you have migrant labor that could be radicalized and returning to Uzbekistan, so you have to deal with that issue. You have an Islamic State that includes Uzbek nationals, that is on the run and might be looking to move to new places. And so there is the potential, even if there's not radicalization happening within Uzbekistan, there is the potential for radical elements to come back in. So there's definitely a security question for Uzbekistan related to that. And then there's a question of if there is going to be greater openness in the region, whether that is through opening of borders, easier transport, is there greater movement for some of these individuals to come back? But there's also the question of, as perhaps the regime's security apparatus relaxes its hold on society, what does that do in terms of creating new opportunities for radicals to take hold? And I think this is something Ilan and I had the chance to meet with a number of senior religious officials, including the senior mufti and the chairman of the Religious Affairs Board. I think there's an interesting balance right now being struck in Uzbekistan between taking a security-centric approach to dealing with Islamic extremism, where there's members of the security apparatus who attend Friday prayers, who make sure that that people do not linger at the mosque, there aren't large groups congregating, who do take a very sort of hands-on approach, which leads to concerns about religious freedom and other issues. But they're also trying to start, I think, creating and crafting their own national religious identity that's much more focused on a Sufi, moderate Islamic heritage that Dr. Fred Starr has done a lot to excavate and unearth in his book, The Lost Enlightenment. They're creating a new center for Islamic civilization in Tashkent. There's several new Islamic schools being created throughout the country. And if those two elements, sort of the security element, but also the ideological element, can be appropriately moderated, so that one starts to be relaxed as the other takes hold, then it would be a very positive story for Uzbekistan in the region. But if that ratio is wrong for whatever reason, it could go the other way, right? If the security apparatus doesn't relax enough, the oppression could lead to more radicalization. If it comes off too soon, then you could have an openness leading to more radicalization as well. So while the story might not be a hotbed of terrorism, I don't think it's an entirely separate issue from what is happening in Central Asia right now.
Yeah, I think that's particularly interesting, especially on the sort of ideological, as you termed it, more of the religious education angle. I think when you see a lot of these folks who commit these acts of terror, their education basis in Islam is not the highest. So it's easier to mislead somebody who doesn't know their own faith very well. And so I think if you have as you said, you have a security approach and you have a softer societal approach, it kind of have to measure these things at the same time. Any thoughts, Ambassador?
I think that ignorance about Uzbekistan's default mode in the United States and more broadly in the West. There is a problem with Islamic extremists in Uzbekistan. It has been exaggerated. And the fact that you've had several spectacular incidents involving Uzbek nationals has fed this exaggeration. But on balance, the problem of extremism within Uzbekistan has been kept largely under control. And the more visible problem has been Uzbeks fighting in Afghanistan and now in Syria and in Iraq, and these incidents in capitals of various places around the world. But it has been exaggerated.
Yeah, I was actually looking at these numbers the other day for an article I was working on. Sort of these three terrorist attacks in 2017 were perpetrated by Uzbeks. The New Year's attack in Istanbul, Stockholm truck attack, and then New York. Out of 1,600 terrorist attacks that were logged in this open source database I was looking at. So if you think about sort of the scales, it's a little bit different than the biggest problem, I think, in terrorism. So let's move on to maybe a little bit rosier topic, I don't know. Let's talk about sort of regional cooperation. So I think it's interesting that Uzbekistan's sort of re-engagement has opened, I think, elevated a lot of hopes of a lot of folks in the region for cooperation, but at the same time you have this problem on the Kazakh-Kyrgyz border. And I think that illustrates some of the difficulties in this sort of personality-driven politics that you still have in Central Asia. So what kind of challenges do you think there are for greater regional cooperation? There's certainly the desire there. Everybody wants more cooperation. It's good for economies, it's good for people, but there have been obvious reasons for why it has not worked in the last decade or so. And so how do you overcome some of these either long-standing problems between states or just sort of functional issues in trade and things like that?
Well, let me start by saying that to me it's all about transportation. I think what you're looking at is a region that has historically been siloed. It's been sort of isolated. The countries have been isolated from one another. This has been a byproduct of fairly stagnant national policies among the Central Asian states, but it's also, let's be clear, has been something that has worked in the benefit of external powers like Russia that are very interested in sort of keeping the grouping divided, sort of keeping sort of the countries unaligned. The way you begin to reverse that is you begin to allow them to talk to each other without intermediaries. And the way you can do that is you have to be able to get from here to there. And so the positive steps and also very early steps, the fact that there's now a direct air link between Dushanbe, Tajikistan, and Tashkent is a very positive development, but it's less than a year old. The fact that there are train links between Tashkent and Astana is a very positive development, also very new. But the more these things build, the more they grow, the more there's resiliency in that independent dialogue that the Central Asian states should be crafting. And by the way, the easier it is to move around the region, the easier it is for foreign businessmen to move around the region. And this is a not insignificant secondary aspect of the larger strategy. It's very hard to envision regional integration in an economically robust way if it's very hard to move around. The easier it is to ship goods, to transport goods, the easier it is to have a serious, sustainable discussion about foreign direct investment, the way Uzbekistan is beginning to talk to the West about. So I think, to me, it's all about this. It's all about sort of breaking those shackles of sort of being the stovepipes of the past, and beginning to figure out how to move around the region better.
How do you think you can sort of institutionalize some of these changes that are made? Because I think if you look at the trajectory, a lot of this sort of resurgence of cooperation occurred after the death of Islam Karimov, because he kind of stood in the way a lot of those initiatives, of his personal relationships around the region. But on the other hand, this also means that a lot of these changes can be sourced personally to the president, so it's still a very personality-driven change. How do you institutionalize some of those changes so that you can continue to trade when a leader has a tiff with another leader? How do you kind of shift the Central Asian model away from the personality-driven politics?
Well,
you'll have the answer.
I don't know that I'll have the answer. I think Ambassador Herbst might have the answer, a better answer. But I would only offer this idea that it is certainly an initiative that started that's personality-driven, but the more international trade agreements, the more sort of legal conventions, multilateral conventions among the states, the more this is sort of institutionalized, the less personal it becomes, and the easier it becomes for other external actors, Russia, China, the European Union, the United States, to buy in to this notion that the region is becoming more interconnected.
I would hesitate to say that the changes we've seen in Uzbekistan over the past 15 months are personality driven. One of the interesting things which is not well understood about the country is that there's a rather cohesive elite, and that that cohesion suggests, I won't say unanimity or necessarily consensus, but a sense among key actors about what's important, what needs to be done next. When I was in Tashkent last week, I had a chance to speak with people and commented on how quickly President Mirziyoyev came out of the box, even as interim president. I was told that, in fact, the things that he'd done were recognized by important folks in Uzbekistan as something that was necessary for the country. So it's not as if he was a lone cowboy out pushing something all by himself. So that's point one. Point two is, it picks up on what Ilan said, which is that you already are seeing the codification of these changes in agreements with the neighbors. And obviously, no agreements are forever. And any country can back away from them as it takes, something we're rediscovering again here in Washington. But it is a barrier, the fact that you have agreements, to walk away from. It's a barrier to removing these changes. So I am confident that what we're seeing in the region, the opening of relations, is something which is going to persist. It can't always be changed, but I think, given Uzbek political culture, what we're seeing represents not just the views of one man.
Sure, if I can add maybe a different element to that. It struck me as really interesting that at this conference in Samarkand, which was about regional cooperation, it was really about the 5 Central Asian republics working together. There was 13 other nations represented, from Latvia to South Korea to the United States, Japan, Iran, India, Pakistan. Why is that? Why do you need all these other countries to talk about how the five countries are going to work together? And I think that's because there is concern, and rightfully so, that there needs to be international buy-in for there to be regional cooperation. It's very easy for any one of the 5 Central Asian countries to sort of be picked off by an external power, especially when you sort of have Russia and China looming on either side. Ambassador Herbst, I think, gave a very, very powerful speech about this in Samarkand that I don't want to steal his thunder, but maybe he'll reprise some of his points. But I do think having the engagement and balance and buy-in of a broad international coalition is also important, right? Because if, for whatever reason, external powers think that greater cooperation, greater awareness within the region is not in their interest, then it's very easy for them to upset the apple cart by just sort of meddling in 1 or 2 of the 5. And so, in addition to the internal and the political and the regional impediments, I do think this international one needs to be recognized as well. And I thought that was one of the achievements of the Samarkand conference, that it wasn't just the 5 foreign ministers talking to each other, that it really was looking to get this international buy-in.
I think that's a very sort of prescient point on sort of the international buy-in in order for there to be regional cooperation. I don't know if anybody else picked up on this, but there was only one Chinese speaker. I thought it was a very light footprint. The One Belt and One Road was mentioned favorably by a number of speakers. I think Mirziyoyev used the favorite Chinese phrase, win-win. But I think, I'm just interested in your thoughts on the sort of the Chinese angle on Central Asia. I think there's a lot of cooperation efforts in terms of infrastructure development and those kinds of things. But it was interesting that there's sort of, it seemed, at least in the context of the Samarkand conference, sort of a little bit of a Chinese standback. Now, I have my read on that, which is, any level of greater transportation links in Central Asia benefits the Chinese vision for the region. So there's no need for a heavy hand on the part of Beijing, because this is going to happen without their pushing, and it's probably best to happen without the overt pushing. But I'd be interested in sort of your take on how Central Asia and China sort of fit together in both of their regional initiatives.
Happy to take a stab. So I think that's right as far as it goes, but I think it would be a mistake not to recognize that the modest showing by China was actually a calculated decision by Uzbekistan. In the conference itself, on the sidelines, in governmental meetings that I've had during this visit and previous visits, I think it was very clear that the Uzbek government understands the potentially all-consuming nature of the One Belt, One Road initiative. I've spent some time myself out in Western China and have sort of seen at least sort of what the macro plan looks like. It looks like a lot of investment, looks like many belts, many roads, with probably less regard for sovereignty among the constituent states that are supplicants than would be expected. And I think the fact that Uzbekistan, in the foreign policy component of the Mirziyoyev strategy, is looking more and more at balancing in the context of Afghanistan, but also balancing in terms of trade, balancing in terms of international relations. That's not an accident. There is trepidation about the fact that if these other areas of foreign policy aren't cultivated, Uzbekistan runs the risk of maybe not being gobbled up by the One Belt, One Road, but certainly being adversely affected by it. And I think it's something that other countries in the region, like Kazakhstan, for example, actually are in far greater danger of, or Kyrgyzstan. But nonetheless, it is a concern, and my sense was that was reflected in the staffing for the conference and the amount of Chinese official representation.
Right now, I think you'd have to say that the external power with the greatest influence in Central Asia is Russia. But there's no question that China is looming more and more, not just as a competitor to Russia, but actually as the successor to Russia in Central Asia. They both enjoy the region, but China has an economic dynamism which Russia does not. And that was apparent when I was in Tashkent 15 years ago. It's even more apparent today. Growing Chinese influence in Central Asia, including Uzbekistan, is virtually guaranteed. But Ilan is right that policymakers in Tashkent pay close attention to power, military, economic. And they recognize both the more immediate danger from Moscow, but the longer range challenge from Beijing. And they take steps in order to offset this. One such step is to make sure they have a better relationship with the EU and with the United States. And I would expect Tashkent to continue to pursue a variety of policies designed to guarantee their ability to make sovereign decisions in the wake of a rise in China.
I just want to pick up real quick on your point about the EU. That was something that I noticed, that there seemed to be a focus on the EU and the UN as kind of core partners in this cooperation effort. I think because they're farther afield, have fewer, I think, political interests, but do have economic interests. Is that something you noticed, or?
Well, what I noticed in Samarkand was the shrewd organizing by the Uzbeks to attach the Central Asian meeting with the foreign minister of the EU to the UN conference. So they got synergy and a much bigger bang in their buck.
Yeah, I think so. Any thoughts, please?
Yeah, I mean, just to your point about President Mirziyoyev's use of the term win-win, as Ilan pointed out, transportation infrastructure is critical to the region, and insofar as One Belt, One Road is about building rail and road and other links, then that there is win-win, right? But does the project extend beyond that? Is I think the question for Uzbekistan and all of us to ask ourselves. And is there sort of additional goals that the Chinese are going to be trying to accomplish as they sort of expand outward this infrastructure links? Might be too early to tell, but I think it's also not a given that this is just about infrastructure and it's an easy win-win for everyone involved.
All right, I have, I think, one more question I'm going to pose to the panel, and then I think I'm going to jump a little bit early to the audience, because I can do that. I'm the one with the microphone. So my sort of final question, a phrase that I definitely use a lot in reference to Uzbekistan is cautious optimism. I know it sometimes frustrates some of my Uzbek friends, because they ask me, why cautious? Why can't you just be optimistic? So I'd be interested, where do you fall on the optimism to pessimism scale with regard to Uzbekistan and its cooperation efforts, first? And then second, sort of how, what needs to be done on the part of Uzbekistan to move you closer to optimism? I think on my part, you have very positive moves in terms of regional cooperation and economic efforts, but you also see some of the hurdles, especially on the sort of human security angles. You still have reports of forced labor in cotton in some regions. You still have some journalists who've been detained. So at the same time you have, 1,600 people taken off the blacklist, you have a writer who returns and he's immediately arrested. So I think there's sort of, it's a 2 steps forward, 1 step back kind of thing. Not that we can necessarily expect anything better. I think that's my sort of final question is, if someone had asked you a year ago what opening and progress in Uzbekistan would realistically look like, is this what it would look like? Or is there something better that Uzbekistan can be doing?
So I think, generally speaking, cautious optimism is exactly sort of where I would end up also. I think on the foreign policy front, it's sort of full-blown optimism in the sense that you're seeing a dynamism that really hasn't existed in the region before. Again, early days, there are external actors that have other ideas. I think the key for the United States is not to have a strategy for Central Asia, but to allow the Central Asian states to talk, to integrate, to sort of foster, empower these sort of discussions. There's hope in some quarters that countries like China and Russia will do it. But that's not the sort of the squeaky wheel. I mean, to me, I think you're absolutely right. Look, this is early days in the sort of domestic dimension of the strategy, and for Uzbekistan, and also for the long-term viability of a strategic partnership with the United States, the domestic dimension is what matters. So cautiously, very optimistic that Uzbekistan is demonstrating the ability to hear sort of dissenting views in a way that it wasn't before, the ability to be open to delegations from Human Rights Watch, to the UN Human Rights Ombudsman in a way that they weren't before. This is all steps in the proper direction. There's a lot of steps that still need to be taken, but for how early we are in this process, I think this is the right track.
I would agree largely with Ilan. The foreign policy opening is for real and is going to bring positive things for Uzbekistan and for the region. Tashkent has always been interested in a closer relationship with Washington. And they've had that in part based on security interests, especially after 9/11 when I was in Tashkent, but also more recently with the Northern Distribution Network. But given the idiosyncrasies of American policy, that is not enough to sustain the type of relationship that they would like. And to truly have that better relationship, there will have to be significant progress, significant change on human rights related issues. And I think that is possible, but it's also true that there's a style of governance in Uzbekistan which makes that not so easy to achieve. They would have to reform the way they do business, the way they think about security for this to be successful. And so that's an important point. And then there's a third point, which is as important. And I touched on this before, but not as fully as I will now. The clear but still small steps we've seen in Uzbekistan on economic liberalization have to be turned into large steps. The Uzbek people historically have been great merchants. So the talent in country to create a thriving economy with less central control that has been the norm is large. If the authorities, in a sense, have faith in their people and are able to manage the very still powerful vested interest in the country, there can be an economic miracle in Uzbekistan which would power great transformation. But on this point, I remain very cautiously.
So I had the difficult task of finding a way to say the exact same thing as Ilan asked for Herbst in a new and novel way, because I agree completely with them. Like them, you know, I share the optimism about what's happening in regional cooperation, some of the steps on economic liberalization, and concern that, you know, we do not take for granted that economic liberalization automatically means political liberalization, right? I mean, I think the Chinese model a whole number of countries that have tried to use economic liberalization as a way to avoid having to loosen their grip on power. That's very much not what we'd like to see happen in Uzbekistan. Maybe to put a different spin on it in terms of what I'd like to see, just reflecting on some of the conversations I had with individuals, members of the Uzbek government, and others, you know, I noticed a very distinct generational gap between individuals that I talked to for whom stability was the watchword, color revolutions and foreign interventions causing color revolutions was the enemy, and who were, you know, very slow to embrace the political liberalization aspect of President Mirziyoyev's reform agenda. One quoted to me half of Winston Churchill's famous quote that democracy is the worst political system, and forgot the clause that follows. And the younger generation that really seemed to be optimistic, energetic, and ambitious in carrying out this agenda and what it meant for their country. And you know, over time, what I'd like to see is a transition to that viewpoint of the younger generation, and hopefully that will achieve all of the things that Ilan and Ambassador Herbst outlined.
Excellent. All right. So I assume everybody's got some good questions. I hope so. I see some friends who should in the audience. So who'd like to go first?